Welcome, everyone. Welcome to APA's Facility Symposium and today's session, which is entitled Design Standards. I'm Scott Turley with the University of Arkansas and the APA Professional Development Committee, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's program. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker here in just a moment, but before we get started, I wanted to cover some basic housekeeping items and how the flow of the content will work today. We'll be recording the sessions and posting those recordings after the event concludes, so they'll be available for us. All attendees are in listen-only mode, and as such, we'll be using the chat feature throughout the program unless your presenter calls for an open mic. We do ask that you be mindful to ensure that your mic is on mute when you are not speaking in order to minimize interruptions and background noise. Please use the chat box function to enter any questions you may have, and we'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation. We'll have time to address questions at various moments during the session. If at any time you experience technical difficulties with audio or visual, please use the chat feature to bring that to our attention, and we'll try to take care of you. It's now my pleasure to welcome Mr. Steve Thweatt, retired from the University of Colorado, and his talk on design standards. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning.
So this is my first Zoom presentation. Hopefully I will do this correctly, and we'll see if we can get this started. So just as by way of introduction, my professional background is a licensed architect, and I'm registered in Colorado, Georgia, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas. I was in private practice as an architect for 15 years, in higher education for 29 years, at Duke University for 6 years as the Director of Facilities Design Office and Assistant Dean of Facilities. Yes, I was actually on the Dean's staff as a faculty member. I wouldn't recommend that for anyone. I was also at Emory University for 6 years as the Associate Vice President for Planning, Design, and Construction, and for 17 years, almost 18, at the University of Colorado. Started out as Director of Planning, Design, and Construction, moved on to campus architect, Associate Vice Chancellor for Facilities, and retired 5 years ago as the Vice Chancellor for Administration. I now do some consulting work primarily at universities, doing program reviews of facilities operations as Thweatt Management Consultants. So here's what we want to cover today. What are standards? Why do we have them? How do we develop them? Who are the stakeholders? How do they get integrated? How do we create feedback and revise them? And how do you make sure they're actually used? So I would suggest that people perhaps take notes of their questions as we go along. And if it's a question that you think should be discussed at that moment, raise your hand in the chat room, and Scott and Billy will decide if that is appropriate or not. If not, we'll wait to the end of the session and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So just so we're on the same page, we want to understand what standards are. They describe and set forth procedures, policies, guidelines, and codes which the institution believes to be representative of desirable practices. In other words, they become our guidelines for what we want to do in terms of design and construction on campus. So what's involved in either developing or administrating campus standards? Well, the first major component is a time commitment. Clearly, standards are just not going to appear overnight. They have to be developed, they have to be worked on, they have to be agreed to, and they have to be updated. So anytime you have a time commitment, you wonder how much time is actually required. So let's talk about how much time there is to develop, how much time is required to develop standards, and then how much time is required to update standards. And we will talk about that. So I've been teaching this class for several years at the Institute, and throughout those discussions, what I have decided and discovered, in addition to my own experience, is that it takes a huge time commitment for standards. Some people may believe that standards are something that's easily put together and easily dealt with, but the fact is it takes an awful lot of time, discussion, and key stakeholder involvements to put these together. So anytime you have a time commitment involved, you've got resources that have to be accounted for. And those resources mean that you have to gain the resources in order to develop or maintain these standards from somebody that has the funding available to do that. That means there's a measurable return on the investment that you have to demonstrate to whoever is going to provide the funding. So we'll talk about what are some of those measurable return on the investments that you can make if you're trying to make a case to get funding to develop or maintain the standards that you currently have. So what would be some of those measurable return on investments? Well, it can save time and money correcting deficiencies by avoiding them in the first place. How many times have you had a project that was either almost through design or even under construction, and you see things that are in that facility that you think are completely wrong and do not fit your campus? They're deficient in some way. Well, with standards, if they're actually followed and enforced, you can avoid those deficiencies in the first place. You can reduce the inventory of parts because you can identify certain kinds of products that you want to have on your campus and narrow the design team to using those kinds of products. Now, if you're a public institution, you've got to usually do a 3 equal type approach. If you're a private institution, you can go sole source as long as you can demonstrate that it's a valid approach for your campus. It protects the long-term interest of the institution. You know, the facilities are the largest capital investment of a campus. And we need to make sure to be the stewards of those facilities as we design and construct them. And clearly it reduces future maintenance costs. If you get the kind of quality products that you need in your facilities, you will have less cost maintaining those in the future. And certainly we all know that maintenance funding is very difficult to come by, and we certainly want to make sure that we do everything we can with the money that we're given. There are times that you will eventually have to negotiate the outcomes, because there are times that everyone's not going to agree on exactly what should be in your standards. And there are so many different elements and participants involved in this process that you have to make sure that you have some mechanism available to negotiate to get those right. So what kind of things end up being negotiated? Perhaps the composition of the standards, perhaps the thoroughness of the standards. You can make them extraordinarily detailed, or you can make those standards very sketchy, very outline type, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And ultimately, you may have to negotiate the enforcement of those standards. Standards are really of no value at all if they're not being enforced. And I have seen many cases where there is no enforcement mechanism in place to do that. So what are some of the benefits of standards? Well, the stakeholders involved, everyone involved in capital projects, are going to be much more satisfied if standards are developed and followed rather than just willy-nilly building whatever you want to build. It protects the institutional interest so that we ensure as facilities professionals that the campus gets what the campus needs and not what the either design team or contractor thinks is best from their perspective. It builds bridges between different departments and different units within the departments, particularly within facilities management, so that all the trade shops and the project manager people are on the same page and have an agreement on how things are going to be done. It pays dividends in the long run. As I said before, you have a lot fewer parts that you have to worry about, a lot fewer types of products that are going to end up being put in your buildings. You have less time educating your consultants. It's all right there in black and white, and they can see exactly what your expectations are. It ensures you get those highest quality facilities, which reduces those maintenance costs in the end. It increases consistency and reduces those maintenance needs going into the future. I've already mentioned the limits on the parts necessary that you need to have available for repair. Now, it doesn't mean that standards are the panacea for everything and solve all the problems. There are actually some disadvantages to having standards. It is very time consuming. As if we were in a live audience, we would talk about what your experiences are in developing and maintaining standards, but I can guarantee you it is not something that is on the side or it takes no time to deal with. It takes plenty of time to develop and keep up with those standards. So it's very, very time consuming. It is costly and drives up overhead because you are demonstrating the kind of products that you want on your campus. And you are in the end driving up cost for a good reason, but it does drive up cost, and you need to recognize that that's true and have things in place to defend your decisions on what you're doing with your standards. It does complicate the process. Just imagine how easy it would be if you just let people do what they wanted to do and accepted whatever building design and construction was put in place on your campus. It would certainly be a whole lot easier. It would drive up your maintenance costs and it would be a headache to deal with, but it certainly would be a much easier process. So don't think it doesn't complicate the process, because it does. People have to understand and follow those standards in order to make it work the way it should. So when you don't have standards, again, you can have those high maintenance costs. You see all kinds of examples around the country of things that probably shouldn't have been designed and built the way they were. This is the Case Western Business School, which is designed by Frank Gehry, one of what we call the Starchitects. And maintenance is clearly not part of the program requirements for buildings like these, but if you'll notice, this is the main entrance for the building. And the way this sloped roof is designed, not that they get any snow there at Case Western, but I think Ohio is known for some of its snow loads. And during the winter of the first year this was built, snow built up on this area of the building to enough depth that icicles were hanging down halfway to the sidewalk. And when it started melting, it all started pummeling down onto the entryway. So eventually they actually had to build a fence in this area to protect people from the melting and falling snow and icicles, and had to use an alternate entrance. So it's important that we understand and manage the way things are designed. Here's another example of a Frank Gehry building at MIT called the Stata Center. And it's quite an amazing building, but I can tell you it has had some problems. For example, I was able to tour the building before it was opened, and I noticed all these yellow banners on the wall. They had actually numbered the leaks and dated them, and buckets were sitting all over the building because of the design of this building was inadequate to meet the needs of the roof. Then you see things that you just really can't believe are true, but in fact they are. We were in San Jose quite a few years back, looked out the window of the room we were presenting in, and here's this row of condensing units. Looks to me like there's one unit for every office. Imagine the maintenance nightmare trying to keep up with that. Standards can also help eliminate bad designs. Here's a Longhorn Grill, which I think is either in Arizona or West Texas. Imagine that. Here's a great building in Bangkok. I call it the Elephant Building. Certainly not something you'd want on your campus. And here's one in Ohio, literally called the Picnic Basket Building. And if you think people make these things up, not true. I actually took a picture of it under construction. And then of course, everyone thinks there's an architect and they can just do whatever they like with whatever building that they're dealing with. So in addition to bad design, it can shorten the lifespan of a building. Product performance and longevity are not always design criteria that the consultants understand. You have to sort of put yourself in the consultant's mindset. And so many of the consultants we hire are used to doing commercial work. And institutional work is much different than commercial work. We have a much higher performance requirement. We have a much higher level of quality. And unless the consultants know exactly what we expect, you may not get what you wish you would have in the first place. You come up with problems that you just can't explain, can't understand, and can't think of why anybody would even think that could work. You have no continuity. You could have dozens of parts for the exact same product in different buildings. You could have 10 different kinds of motors in buildings as opposed to 2 or 3 that you can really manage and keep up with. So you can develop all these kind of problems with parts. We were in Dallas quite a few years ago, and when you looked out the window of where we were staying there, you actually saw on top of this building this house, which turned out to be a radio station there in Dallas. And my only question was always, did they build the building under the house, or did they actually build a house on top of the building? But in any case, it's something you certainly wouldn't ever want to see in your campus. So what problems? All of the problems that we talked about above leads to frustration, which leads to mistrust between campus facilities, units within campus facilities, and the design team that we hired to do these projects. So you can lead to all kind of really small mistakes where people are trying to make up for things that they didn't do adequately during the design, or quite large ones, as this building that toppled over in China. You can find unusual situations where people just make adaptations to try and make things work. So when you talk about standards, there's actually 2 kinds of standards. There are design standards, which actually covers the policies of design on your campus and the graphic representations of what you want the campus to look like. And if you look at different campuses, you'll see that there are all kinds of ways this can be done. So let's just take 2 extreme examples. If you take Yale University as one example, you have a very consistent kind of architecture that's been developed over a century of design and construction work. And then you take a campus like the University of Cincinnati, and every building on the campus of the University of Cincinnati is unique into itself. Even though all the campuses work together as a fabric on the university, none of the buildings look alike. None of them have very familiar or similar details. So you want to set the kind of policy for your campus that you want to dictate the way designs are handled going forward. Then there are construction standards, which talk about the systems and the products that you want to be contained within the design of those projects on your campus. So your design standards should handle the design philosophy, the consistency and quality of your design, the process by which a design takes place and gets approved, the aesthetics that you expect to see on your campus, and the planning principles, such as the space between the buildings, the way the buildings are organized, the different dedicated areas of the campus that are dedicated to different uses. It should outline the owner's responsibilities. What is it we are going to provide to the consultants and the contractors to make sure that the projects are built according to the way we want them to be. And it should outline the submittal requirements that you have for both design and construction. Should contain the contract forms that you will use to bring both parties in this process under contract. So most campus standards now are online, and you can see this just happens to be the University of Colorado standards. Certainly you go online through the facilities homepage and find them easy enough. We published a book for design guidelines and also put those on the web as well, but they're distinctly different, and they have a lot of pictures and verbiage about the design of the campus itself. Had the same thing at Emory. We had design standards, followed a much different kind of design at Emory, but it still outlined exactly what our expectations were. So that brings up the question of who's responsible to enforce those design standards. And it really could be any number of people. If you have a university architect on your campus or a campus architect, that is usually their primary responsibility. It's also the responsibility of the planners that you have on campus working with university architect. And some campuses, including the University of Colorado Boulder, has a design review board which is comprised of outside consulting architects that work with the university to ensure that the design is consistent with the campus and the campus fabric. So even though we can't actually force people to use standards, we certainly can find ways to make sure that they're enforced. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So one of the first things you have to do is decide how you're going to organize these standards if you don't have them in place already. You can have generic standards, which really issues simple guidelines and ideas. So you give the design team a lot of flexibility in how they want to design the buildings that are going to be on your campus. Or you can have specific, which is what most campuses have. They're much more detailed, almost to the point that there are specifications. There are three basic types of standards that you can have in terms of organization: prescriptive, descriptive, and performance. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of those three. So the general outline of construction standards as opposed to design standards, you talk about the life expectancy of the buildings that you want to design. You talk specifically about the products used for the design palette, whether it's brick, stone, aluminum, glass, all the different products that are used to design a building. You establish the graphic standards you want the design team to follow in terms of CAD production, computer-aided design, whether you want to have building information modeling or BIM, the codes that are followed by your campus and your state. You list the acceptable products, because if you don't tell them what you want, you will get what they think you need. It should handle the accessibility issues in terms of ADA compliance and those sorts of things. It should cover the utilities required to service the buildings, any hazardous materials and how that's dealt with. And then there are the technical sections of the specifications that actually talk about the very specific products for each of the divisions of your expected specifications. So if you're trying to develop standards or simply trying to update what you have, one of the terrific reference tools that APA has available is the body of knowledge. And the body of knowledge is certainly organized to match the way the Institute is organized: 4 different parts: general administration, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. And you can easily go into that body of knowledge on the web and pick out many sections that will really help you ascertain what's appropriate for your campus standards. University of Colorado has prescriptive-based standards, and they're on the web. I put the web address here, which you can probably get later, or you can easily go online and just take a look at them. They are organized much like the CSI, Construction Specifications Institute, following this format. And they are in 3 different parts. Part 1 is, well, I forget exactly the 3 parts, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with CSI. Emory, much the same way. Prescriptive, there's some introductory parts, and then there's some detailed, just like, again, like the CSI format. And at Emory and Colorado, we always tried to highlight any differences that appeared from one year standards to the next, because it's impossible to expect that the consultants would understand what changes you might have made to the standards if they had done a project 3 or 4 years ago. They need to understand what the updated standards are like. In doing some research, I found some descriptive-based standards for South Dakota State University, and they're slightly different in that they have much more verbiage as opposed to organized like a CSI format. Excuse me. And then University of California, Irvine has performance-based standards, and they simply describe the outcome that they want for a building. In other words, they talk about how they want the building to perform as opposed to describing every single product and method that they want their buildings designed by. It's a fairly unique approach, but it works really well for Irvine. And I will say that Irvine does probably 95% of their projects design build, and performance-based standards are really well suited for a design build format, because you're not really hamstringing the design team and the contractor. You're letting them use a lot of their own initiative on how to best design and build a building at the most economical way possible. So when it comes to enforcement, whose responsibility is it to enforce the standards? Well, I think it's actually a team effort. Certainly the project manager for a project has a lot to do with it and needs to take a heavy responsibility in making sure that the standards are enforced. However, it's not really realistic, in my opinion, to expect the project manager to not only know and understand all aspects of standards, but to be so familiar with the drawings and the details of the project to ensure their enforcement. I mean, put yourself in their position. If your standards, if they were printed out, would probably fill 3 binders, like 3-inch thick binders worth of information. And now a, say, $15 million building is going to have about 150 to 200 drawings. It's not realistic to expect that a project manager would know all of that by heart and be able to make sure that the standards are followed and ensure that they are followed. It's much more realistic to believe and to put in place a team that can focus on their area of expertise. So for example, the trade shops, the plumbers would be looking at the plumbing and they know everything they need to know about plumbing. Whereas the project manager may have a working knowledge of plumbing, but certainly not a lot about the detail of plumbing. So it's incumbent upon the trade shops to accept that responsibility and to make sure that they're monitoring and helping make sure that the plumbing portion of that project is in alignment with the standards. Then the project manager can enforce that once they get direction. They need to be supported by the director of planning, design, and construction and the director of operation and maintenance, and they have to work as a team to make sure that all areas of the department are working together to make sure this happens as well as it can. The inspectors certainly have a role to play because they're out there on the job site all the time, making sure things are built as they're supposed to be. And I highly advise monthly construction walkthroughs. At Emory, we used to every month take a representative from each trade shop. It was required that they attend, and we walked the project for about an hour so they could see what was going on and notice things that were being done incorrectly while they were being installed rather than have to tear them out later. It's a great thing to do, well worth the investment of time. So there are some process decisions that need to be made. Are you going to just lock yourself in a closet and design these standards or update them, make them what you want them to be? Or are you going to do an open approach so that you've included many of the stakeholders that you've identified, help as a team establish the format and develop the standards as a team rather than do it all by yourself? Certainly you're going to get a lot more buy-in if you take the open approach. But I will say the closed approach is much easier. There's no arguments, there's no negotiating. You just tell them what you want to do and you do it. I don't recommend it, however. Now, if you go to the July and August 2018 Facilities Manager Magazine, there's about 12 case studies of design and construction standards. And I pulled out the Michigan State University as a good example of something, a decent format to put into place to deal with standards. So at MSU, they have 10 staff members, which are designated construction standard stewards. They're responsible for changes to standards in their field of expertise. It's a collaborative environment, and they completely emphasize all the time that they're all going to work together and they're going to always arrive at agreement on whatever issue they're facing. Project teams make decisions as long as they get approval from this group, this construction standard stewards. So they're in complete control of the use of the standards and has been proven to be very successful. As a part of this process, they begin to call into question 100-year buildings. And this is something I've actually been talking about and thinking about for several years. We tend to build the absolute highest performing, best buildings we can build, which make them quite expensive. And I'm sure many of you that are involved in this part of the industry are constantly faced with questions from upper administrators. Why do things cost so much? Why do we have to pay so much money for our buildings? And part of that is because we build them so with such high quality to avoid the long-term maintenance cost that the first capital costs are quite high. And with the changing pedagogy and the changing program requirements that we see on campus, and this is the COVID virus is actually a terrific example of how things can change immediately, and we have to be very responsive to those changes. So one has to say, maybe what we should do is build buildings that have 100-year exteriors, but 20-year interiors. So they're not so expensive to tear apart and rebuild and reformat, reconfigure. It's just something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and MSU is beginning to face that question. I think it's something we all should be thinking about. So when I do the class, we usually have a discussion about this right now, but right now, I'll tell you my experiences with this. Excuse me. Smoke from the fires here in Colorado has been playing heck with my sinuses. And that is critical reviews. You know, when you think about how standards are developed, they're developed over a long period of time, and they have a lot of people that have preferences for what they really like to see. For example, some plumbers may just prefer Kohler, just for whatever reason. They may have this proclivity to want to have Kohler. And other trade shops might have specific likes and dislikes for certain products. But over the years, we tend to make them very high layered, I say. Gold plated is what we were accused of at Colorado. And there was some truth to that. So we decided in 2001, maybe we should get an outside consulting firm that has done work on our campus and is familiar with how we do things to take a look at our standards and tell us if there were things they thought we should consider revising. I thought it was a very good idea. So in the end, we hired a local firm. They did a thorough review of all of our standards, and they came up with a list. You certainly are not going to be able to read this, but there was a list of different sections, parts within those sections, the description of their recommendation, and what we on the campus agreed to or disagreed to and negotiated to make those changes. We did it again in 2004 as a result of a particular project that we were working on. And on that particular project, this was an addition to the business school, and one of the board members of the business school was a local real estate developer. It made the claim to the dean that if we would just do buildings the way the developer did buildings, he could easily save 20% off the cost of the project. Well, clearly, we don't build buildings like developers build buildings, but the dean really liked the idea of 20% savings. So he decided to cut the budget by 20% and told us to go work with the developer on revising our standards. So we did that. And in the end, the developer made a whole series of recommendations, and we went to the dean and talked about the implications of those. So just by way of example, they had recommended that we have a thermostat in the faculty offices, one thermostat for every 10 faculty offices, as opposed to 1 per 3 faculty offices in our standards. And so we knew the implications of that. Our highest volume of work orders was hot and cold calls, and you can put 3 different offices together, and 3 different occupants of those offices will have 3 different desires for temperature. One will want it hot, one will want it cold, one will want it medium. And so we told the dean, if you decide to go with 1 per 10, you're going to see a multiple increase in hot and cold calls. And the only way we're willing to accept that is if we route those work orders to your office and you take care of those hot and cold calls. Otherwise, we are not willing to take that additional burden on. So as in the end, we only ended up accepting 3% of the recommendations from the developer because of the implications of what would happen in the future. And sure enough, the project came in 20% over the budget because the dean had cut the budget by 20%. So that pretty well satisfied the dean that we actually had a decent set of standards to begin with. Then we did the same review at Emory. It was driven by the recession, the 2008, 2009 recession. And in 2010, we got so much criticism because of the high cost of construction on the campus, even though costs were going down as a result of the recession. We decided to do the critical review so that we could gain our credibility back, deflect criticism on why we were doing what we were doing, and certainly we were interested in saving money along with the campus. So we followed much the same format. We hired an outside firm. They made a recommendation in this column, and we had the overview of what that recommendation and what we were willing to do. So one example from the Emory review, we made a list of rooms that were required within the standards for different things. For example, we had changing rooms to meet a lead point. We had bicycle storage rooms, again, for a lead point. We had recycling rooms, lactation rooms, single occupancy, family restrooms, a whole list of requirements and the square footage requirements as a result of those. So we took a building that was under design at the time, 200,000 square foot, gross square foot, net square foot laboratory building. And when we applied all of these areas that we, in our standards, required space dedicated, we found that we had 4,800 square feet of space dedicated for things that were really not related to the use of the building at all, but for campus support of that building. So we took a very modest $200 a square foot. It should have actually been somewhere around $600, truth be known, but we were trying to be nice about it. And when we multiplied the square footage by that amount of money, it was just under $1 million implications to add all of these spaces in that building to support the building. And so what it made us do is realize we shouldn't mandate these dedicated spaces. We should recommend them, and in each project, we should decide whether or not that's needed. So by way of example, the building maintenance shop, 625 square foot. Well, if you look at a zone maintenance approach, you can have a building maintenance shop in a zone, not in every single building. And ultimately, we decided there were a number of things that we could do to reduce our standards and really make things much more viable. One example are fume hoods. We were recommended to go low flow, which is 6, well, that's changes per hour. Anyway, we were recommended to go low flow. We went to environmental health and safety. We had 100 feet per minute phase velocity. The low flow went down to 60. EH&S wouldn't go to 60, but we did convince them to go to 80. We looked at one small single lab renovation in a chemistry building, and we estimated the savings on that one decision alone to be $9,500 in energy savings a year. Then we looked at air changes. We reduced from 10 to 12 changes per hour down to 8 changes per hour. That saved $500,000 in construction savings on that 200,000 square foot building that I had a couple of slides ago. And that's because you could reduce the ductwork size, you could reduce the motor sizes, the air handling size. Everything could be reduced if you reduce the changes in the air per hour. And there was absolutely no effect on the use of the laboratories at all. So once you get through all that and you have standards in place, you need to have, or you have standards ready to be put in place, you need a feedback mechanism to make sure that things are taking place as they should. So when people review projects, they need a way to get that feedback to whoever's in charge of the enforcement. It can be memos, letters, spreadsheets, marked up drawings, PDF. There's all kind of ways to get that back. You just need the one in place that works best for you. You need a conflict resolution plan. You're going to sometimes have conflicting requirements between electrical and mechanical, between aesthetics and maintenance. You're going to have these conflicting things that just need to be resolved. So you need a way to resolve them. You need to be able to deal with initial cost versus continuing cost, visual versus functional, the corporate versus personal. And by that, I mean, there are some people that just have a real desire to have a specific product in that campus, no matter what. And that's the personal. Somebody's been in the shop for 30 years and by God, this is how we're going to do it. And sometimes you need a much broader perspective of that, and you need a way to resolve those when those conflicts come up. So if there is one single thing that can make or break the effectiveness of standards, when I ask this in classes that we have, consistently the answer becomes plan reviews. If you do not have effective plan reviews, the entire process falls completely apart. Because it's like having speeding laws, and if they're not enforced, people just drive however the heck they want. And without enforcement, you certainly are not going to be able to manage the things that you're hoping to manage with your standards. So plan reviews is the best process by which to make sure that enforcement occurs, because somebody is always looking at what's taking place, and it begins to provide that desperately needed collaboration between planning, design, and construction in the operations group. So the purpose of plan reviews ensure the standards are followed, confirm or challenge any design issues that come forward, because some designs need to be challenged. Not every designer does things that we think makes any sense at all, and sometimes they go way off the rails in ways that you just can't imagine could happen. I was in Providence, Rhode Island a couple of years ago and saw this nice ductwork here on this roof and figured they must have needed some air over here, so they were going to take it from here. You know, you just have to keep your eyes out on things. It's an opportunity to do a code review, because you can't let code issues occur on your campus, whether you're the jurisdiction having authority or not. You want to make sure that you have an opportunity to match the specific situation with standards, because standards don't always apply to every single situation. There are times that you need to modify and adjust and deviate from your standards. It's also a chance for people to share experiences. When you do a plan review and somebody sees a certain installation or recommendation of a particular product, and they say, hey, I've had experience with that product, it's not going to work. We really don't want to be doing that. So it's a perfect chance to do that, such as this, where the water is just splashing outside the bowl. So there are clearly benefits. It involves all the stakeholders, or it should. It ensures quality. It establishes the expectations that you have for a project. It can verify the results that you're going to get, and it does develop the process itself. So that leads one to say, well, how do you manage that design process? And there are a number of ways to do it, and I'll just show you a couple. At CU, what they decided to do was to hire a part-time retiree as a plan review coordinator. So Colorado has this unique, maybe not, but they have this situation when a state employee retires, they have the ability to come back and work at the place of retirement for up to 100 days a year. So every year, as long as the employee and the institution are willing, this person can work basically part-time, but they can bring that wealth of knowledge that they have for all the years they work there. And so it turns out that this person that they rehired as a plan review coordinator would be able to work just enough time to make the process work, but not be a full-time burden on the cost of the process. It was a terrific solution. So the plan review coordinator would email a request for a plan review to all the different stakeholders involved. They would log the request on their computer. They would establish a due date that comments of the review were due back. They would check to make sure that all information was available for the reviewer. The reviewers, the people that were supposed to be reviewing the plans, would log in each morning and check for new notices of current reviews required. The plan review room, which used to have, next slide will show it, all these cubby holes for specs and layout tables for plans, and it got converted several years back to a series of 30-inch high-definition monitors, so it was all electronic. Here was the plan review room prior to the conversion to 30-inch monitors. The plan review coordinator checked the deadlines each time they logged in their computer to make sure people were doing what they were supposed to. And when they collected all the comments, they emailed them to the project manager, who then sent them to the consultants for incorporation into the plans. And they took a 2-week design review period down to a 3 to 5 day turnaround. Pretty impressive, in my opinion. And then Kate from UT Austin, a couple of years ago, told me about this. They have 5 people on their staff that are designated a plan review team. They're responsible for the plan reviews in their field of expertise. They emphasize, again, collaboration. It's been in place for 3+ years, and they saw a remarkable reduction in construction change orders to a 5% reduction just for that one process. And some change orders can cost quite a bit of money, so I thought that was pretty impressive. I also recommend page turning sessions where approximately once a month on a reasonable sized project, you gather representatives of each trade shop, and the design team goes through pages, literally turning the pages on the plans and reviewing it with the trade shop so that you can identify problems during the design phase. How do you track comments and how effective is it? If you can't track the comments, it's not going to do much good to have these plan reviews. So you can do a spreadsheet like we have right here, where you simply say the area that you're reviewing, what the comments are, and the follow-up recommendations. You can do marked up PDFs if you have hard copies of the design reviews. You can make all kind of comments. I mean, you can keep track of everything you want to do. At Emory, they used a simple spreadsheet. They listed the areas, the issue, the comments, and the response from the consultant. You just need some mechanism to keep up with things. One thing to remember is that the standards are guidelines only. They're certainly not code required. They're certainly not written in law, but they are something that sets out our expectations in a very clear way. I had one mechanical engineer at CU Boulder that developed an OOPS list, what he called hot buttons, because during plan reviews, he would see the same issues reoccurring over and over and over by the mechanical engineers. And so he made this really nice list of issues to avoid. And if the consultants would not only review the standards, but look at his OOPS list, it would save a lot of heartache down the road. So again, these standards are not etched in stone. They're definitely not code required, but they are guidance that we really want to make sure our consultants follow. It does not relieve the consultants of their fiduciary responsibility. They have a professional responsibility to give us the best thing they can give us, and this does not relieve them of that. They have to follow the codes. They have a standard of care, professional standard of care they have to follow, and we certainly expect professional judgment from them. Just because we give them standards doesn't mean it relieves them of any of their contractual responsibilities. It's their professional duty. And then you start asking the question, well, when can we and should we deviate? Under what conditions should we allow deviations? So I would steer you to answer that question to the University of Illinois, who developed a really good variance process. They have a website for it. And when there are conflicts that arise and the standards should be relaxed or deviated from, they have a process they follow by which they allow that to occur. So it's not just decided by one person, they have a panel, and it's a very, very good process. I would encourage you to take a look at that if it's a question that you face. So what are some of the challenges that we're going to face in this? Well, technology is certainly presenting a huge, huge challenge. Again, the COVID virus has shown us that now we do meetings by Zoom, and we have to learn to do things in a much different way. And technology just changes so rapidly that it's awfully hard to keep up with it. But it's our responsibility to do the best we can with it. There are new learning pedagogies coming along all the time. We want to make sure that we position ourselves to support those pedagogies and not just do things the same old way we've always been doing them. There are advancements in products every single year. Things get more and more complex and complicated. And then we certainly have to make sure that we have a mechanism in place to enforce those standards. Then you have your commissioning agent, who is a single person that has huge responsibilities to make sure that there are complicated buildings are brought online in the most reasonable manner, in a way that we can all understand, utilize, and maintain those facilities. They need to be involved in the standards and the review process as much as anybody, not just come out at the end of the project and test things to make sure they work as they should. So why aren't standards followed if they're so darn good? Well, they're awfully long. You go look at any standards on any website, and it's page after page after page after page. It's awfully hard to have an expectation that a consultant would know every single thing in those standards when we've been living with them for years and years, and they've seen them for the first time. So you have to give them some understanding that that is a monumental task that they have to do. Sometimes they're simply too detailed. And I have seen consultants that take standards and use them as their specifications, which I think is a really, really bad idea, because you are flirting with taking over their professional responsibility when that happens. So if they're that detailed, it is very what's the right word? A consultant wants to take those standards just and copy them and paste them into their specifications. Convenient is the word I was thinking. It's not a good idea. They can override some good design ideas. We can be so restrictive that consultants that could have some great design ideas simply are not able to do that. They can deflect liability if you're not careful. They shouldn't, and by law they really can't, but a consultant can make a case, hey, you told me to do it that way. It's not my fault it doesn't work. That's the way you wanted it. They could be outdated if we don't keep them up. We've got to keep them current. So to ensure this compliance, we need to make sure that we have a contractual obligation should be written into the design contracts and the construction contracts that they will follow our standards. Should be a shared cost when there's deviations that need to be accommodated. We need to be reasonable. I can't say that enough. If you're reasonable, you'll have much more success than if you take a hard stand on every single little issue you face. You shouldn't be used as specifications. I love this spec book for this tiny little phone. It's just such a great illustration of how we sometimes overdo things. So how often should you update? Well, it's really a continuous thing, and you can't modify your standards daily or it's impossible to keep up with. So even though it's continuous, I would say semi-annual or annual is a way to republish the standards. So on the continuous side, you make notes of things you want to change, and you keep everyone that reviews and is involved in the plan review process should make notes of the standard, the changes that should be made in standards. And when the semi-annual or annual modifications come up, revisions come up, those comments they've been keeping up with should then be incorporated into the standards. You can decide whether it's a formal or informal update. I think formal is the best way to do it, because that way you have a clear bookmark on exactly when standards are in effect and when the old ones are no longer useful. So with that, I will certainly entertain any questions that people have. Assuming everybody's still with us.
Remember, you can post to the chat if you have questions, or Billy, I don't know if they can unmute and speak to the group.
Glad you came on, Scott. I thought I had lost you.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, if somebody wants to just raise their hand, I can unmute them. Doesn't look like we're getting any questions, Steve. I think you gave everybody a lot to think about.
Whew.
I'll throw
Good.
one out there, Steve. Maybe comment, you sort of touched on this, the difference between standards and a design guide.
Yes.
You know, I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and so I tend to think about, you know, pieces and parts and things and systems, whereas our design review board is really looking at more, you know, architectural context and materials of construction. And
Right.
so maybe comment on that if you would.
Sure. And that's why I had this divided into those two sections. You have the design standards and you have the construction standards. And just as you suggested, the design standards really are talking about the concepts of design, the way buildings look, the way buildings interact with the campus, the open spaces between the buildings, the design principles of the campus, and the construction standards really focus on the products. What kind of motors do we want? What kind of fire alarms do we want? What kind of mechanical systems do we want? And those two go hand in hand, but they are quite separate in the approach and the people that review and try to maintain those standards. Does that answer your question?
It does. I think we're struggling a little bit with, we've had a design review board for, I don't know, probably about 20 years, and we're trying to kind of rethink, are they doing everything they ought to be, or maybe doing more than they should be? And so
Yeah.
a lot of that, it takes on the character of the people who are on that board. And so
Yes, it does. In fact, I think the design review board at the University of Colorado is the second oldest design review board in the country. University of Washington had the first design review board. And the way ours works is that the university architect, the campus architect, is the primary funnel through which all design decisions are made. So the design review board, which I think has 3 architects, a landscape architect, and an urban planner, review designs at conceptual, schematic, and design development. And they make recommendations to the university architect on changes that they think should be made, or totally agree with a design that is developed by a consultant team. And then the university architect weeds through those recommendations and decides exactly what should be implemented into the project and instructs the design team accordingly. And it works pretty well. It certainly is highly dependent on those particular members of the design review board. Some have very strong opinions about certain things and others not so much. And it's up to the university architect to filter those into a cohesive set of recommendations.
other questions?
I think I put everybody to sleep.
It's a lot to cover.
It is.
How much time do you normally use to cover this at the Institute?
It's usually an hour and 50 minutes.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of questions and discussion throughout. So, you know, the remainder of time from now to then would have been in discussion.
It's harder to do with this format.
It is.
So I'll give, all right, we have a question in the chat. it says, we struggle to get the A&E team to provide required information at each stage of design submittal, even though the requirements are in our standards. What recommendations or suggestions could you help offer to help overcome that?
Okay, that is a typical issue. Getting compliance from your design team is not exactly easy. So it's one thing to have these in place and to talk about enforcement. It's another to actually make that occur. And my recommendation always ends up being money walks and money talks. The only thing that really ends up having any leverage is money. So if you start having slow responses or AEs ignoring your requirements, giving you less information than you need and require, start holding their money back. And you tell them, I am not going to pay you until you do what we need, period. So, you know, in the end, they're going to end up doing what you need done or they're not going to get paid. It's really simple. And if you make that clear up front in the very beginning and say, look, we're not going to be punitive, but if you don't do what we ask and you don't meet the requirements, we are going to sit on your invoice until we get what we want. So let's just avoid that in the first place and let's cooperate together. Here's what we need. Make sure you do it. It's really a simple thing. It's just making them do it. And they're not always good about it, I will say. That's a problem.
Do you write that into their contract?
Absolutely. Look,
Okay.
what I always say, you're the owner, you have the money. They're not going to sue you to get the money unless it's egregious. Use it to your advantage. That's the only leverage you really have is their pay. Use it to your advantage. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay. David, thank you for your question. Anything else? Well, Steve, thank you so much for sharing your information with us. And again, I think the sessions will be recorded and available for follow-up. Billy, anything else you need to tell us?
Not at this time. Just everyone be safe and stay healthy.
Yeah,
And
thanks,
have
everyone.
a great holiday season.
Sounds great. Thank you, Steve.
Same for me. You bet.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.